Who do you think made this city, right? Is that what your question was?
Scottish, no?
Was it French? Were they French?
Who built the city? No, we don't know.
It was really the guy that was on his hands and knees getting dirty that built the city. We don't know these people. We never will know who they were. So those type of people built Chicago.
Who built Chicago?
Okay, I found this.
Chicago really began on the shores of Lake Michigan. It was just a frontier town, hard-scrabble place, but it had a lot of potential.
The Irish came and dug the I&M Canal, which was one of the most important generators for the city in the mid-19th century.
The reason why they did the canal is because the only work that they could do, just brutal, hard work.
It was our link from the East Coast to the Western world.
The birth of the skyscraper began here, and people take pride in that.
I'm an educator and an urbanist. I mainly write about the city. And I write about the city from the perspective of the integration of landscape, infrastructure, and network systems, and how those three things together are responsible for the development of the city. One of the first things you notice when you come to Chicago is the presence of water. A city that's supposedly in the middle of the country, and there's coastline and there's beaches within walking distance, and that was a complete surprise to me. There's no archival material to visualize how tough it was maybe at that time period in the Canal Port area, but I think it was pretty dark. It was dirty, it was tough. So Kevin, I guess it's hard for us to identify with the conditions that the laborers worked under.
The people who worked on this were digging through a swamp. So that meant that from at least their ankles, probably to their chest, in freezing cold water. They were then using picks, shovels, and their hands to dig this wet, heavy, mucky soil, to dig it out to create the channel for the canal. So the work was extraordinarily hard. It was backbreaking. We're talking about people who were at the bottom of the social status scale. There were thousands of hands, more dreams than skill. One sky, 12 years, 5,000 died. What we're looking at is Canal Port, but this is where the dirty work of digging that canal would take place. And so this is where the Irish workers came and settled.
The area we're in still has the shifted grid, which is very different than the Jeffersonian grid of the city.
That's
is that
right.
Correct?
It has a completely different grid than the rest of the city. Lots of the very earliest buildings in the city were below the level of the sidewalk or close to it. One family would live at the front and the other family would live at the back.
Many of the workers got land in lieu of payment.
They didn't have the money to pay the workers. A great deal of faith being placed in the future growth of the city.
I come from a very different era, and I think other people in my generation left Ireland under very different circumstances, and so it's hard for me personally to identify with the kind of Irish story.
St. Patrick's was the mother parish of the Chicago Irish, so it was the first church built on the west side of the city by the Irish in the 1840s. They built not just churches, also schools. It was a remarkable way to create community and also to help children get up the social and economic ladder. It really worked.
Do you think then that's the reason why the Irish infiltrated the kind of political organization of the city in the way they did?
It's such a male-dominated activity that it really doesn't account for the women who formed such an important part of Chicago. What women accomplished in terms of building institutions, largely Catholic schools and hospitals and high schools. This is what gave the children and grandchildren of immigrants a push up so that they could enter other areas of professionalism beyond politics.
We could say women built this city.
Women built this city in fundamental ways that have not been acknowledged in the history books.
What was really fascinating is to learn the equally significant role women played in the city. They were the social engineers, the community architects of their day.
Politics in the city of Chicago has been essentially defined by the Irish really since the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s. Chicago elected its first Irish mayor, Thomas Dyer, in 1856. Since that time, 11 men and 1 woman of Irish descent have occupied the 5th floor of City Hall as mayor of the city. 5 of those mayors came from the very important political neighborhood of Bridgeport. The Irish not only built the early infrastructure of the city, those canal workers lost their lives to cholera, to horrible accidents, and they lived in squalor in little wooden shacks. But they rose above that station in life to dominate the political scene of Chicago. To say that Irish immigrant labor built this city is not an overstatement. Because after they built the city, they built the tradition, they also built the culture. Chicago is still, I think, the most Irish city in the United States.
I don't know if Chicago is the most Irish city in the US. I think Chicago, yes, is supposedly the quintessential American city simply for the reason that it had such diversity.
People from different corners of the world, they made this city all together.
The Irish, the Chinese, Italian,
Polish people.
Everyone built the city.
It's an impossible question to answer. There's too many to count. We all built it as one nation.
When I came here, I was aware of the legacy of IIT as an institution in the city, but not the kind of close ties between IIT and Ireland.
Mies van der Rohe started the architecture school, and there's a whole generation of Irish architects who came to IIT and then went back to Ireland and disseminated this sort of teaching. So the influence that started here in Chicago sort of rippled across the world and certainly back to Ireland. The architect Robin Walker studied here under Mies and taught here under Mies before returning to Ireland, started the firm Scott Talon Walker. Mies's former pupils taught a whole generation of Irish architects, so you can see the influence of this building to this very day in Ireland.
John, you're Irish American. Do you identify with being Irish?
In traveling back and forth to Ireland, I realize the way in which I am Irish. And I think there's a particular Irish sensibility. If I go back to that poem by Heaney called Digging, and I think he's alluding to this kind of Irish work ethic, or how his ancestors dug in the ground for peat, but also digging on a very intellectual level. That's sort of an analog for what I try to do as an architect, but with space and materials.
I think it's really fantastic that a show like this is here in Chicago. Irish architects can compete, on a much more global level, and that the work they do has resonance outside of Ireland. The role the Irish played in building the city or in architecture of the city was kind of behind the scenes. This exhibit kind of flips that relationship where it puts, the Irish to the forefront in the design and the kind of front stage of design. Great sense of pride that they have this forum for their work. It's fantastic. I guess it's through my own interests as an urbanist and a writer now that I identify with the early Irish community. In fact, they began the infrastructural evolution of Chicago. And here I am 150 years later, writing about the same things. Their story really resonates with me now in the way perhaps it didn't have before.